The rumble of the bus engine was a constant low hum that vibrated up through the floor and into the soles of his boots. It was a sound so different from the ones he had grown used to, a sound that didn't carry the threat of explosion or the sharp crack of something breaking. It was just a sound, a peaceful, monotonous sound that spoke of pavement and distance, of a world moving at a predictable, safe pace. He sat by the window, his forehead resting against the cool, vibrating glass, watching the world smear past in streaks of green and blue. The green was so much greener than he remembered, the blue of the sky so much wider and cleaner. It was like watching a movie filmed in Technicolor after 2 years of living in a world of muted browns and dusty grays. He clutched the duffel bag in his lap, its worn canvas soft under his fingers. The bag wasn't heavy, not physically. It held a couple of changes of civilian clothes that felt stiff and foreign on his skin, a worn paperback with the corners folded down, and a few toiletries. It was pathetically light, a stark contrast to the immense weight he felt he was carrying on the inside. The bag was just a shell, a symbol of the life he was supposed to be picking up again. His real baggage was invisible, a tangled mess of memories and echoes that he couldn't yet unpack. He looked at his reflection in the window, a ghost superimposed over the passing trees. The face looking back was thinner, the eyes a little more hollow, the skin pulled tight over cheekbones that had been hidden before. It was his face, but it was also the face of a stranger. His hand drifted from the bag to the pocket of his jeans. He could feel the hard, solid shape of it through the denim. The key. It was a simple brass house key, slightly tarnished with age, its edges worn smooth from years of use. For 730 days, that key had been his talisman. In the suffocating heat, when the air was thick with sand and tension, he would close his eyes and trace its shape in his mind. He would remember the specific, satisfying click it made as it turned in the lock. He would remember the way the door would swing open, revealing the small, familiar hallway. He could almost smell it, the faint scent of old wood, lemon polish, and the peace that lived within those walls. That key was more than just a piece of metal. It was a promise. It was the promise of silence, of a bed that was his own, of a door that locked the world out. It was the anchor that had kept him from drifting away completely. He remembered the day he had left, standing in that same hallway and looking back. The sun had been streaming through the window by the door, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden stars. He had made a mental picture of it, capturing every detail. The scuff mark on the baseboard from where he had once dropped a heavy box, the slightly crooked picture frame hanging on the wall, the third floorboard that always let out a soft, complaining squeak when you stepped on it just right. These were the small, insignificant details of a life he had taken for granted, and they had become the sacred texts he recited to himself in the dark. The squeak of the floorboard was the sound of safety. The view from the window was the color of peace. The bus began to slow, the hum of the engine dropping to a lower pitch as it navigated the streets of a town that was both familiar and strange. He saw the old water tower on the hill, its name painted in bold, fading letters. He passed the diner with the flickering neon sign, a place where he had spent countless afternoons drinking coffee and watching the world go by. It was still there, still flickering. A wave of something that felt like nausea and excitement all at once washed over him. This was it. He was really here. The other life, the one that felt like a dream he was finally waking up from, was fading with every mile. The life he was returning to felt just as unreal. A place he had only visited in his mind for so long that he wasn't sure it actually existed anymore. The bus hissed to a stop at the corner of Oakwood Avenue, the pneumatic doors sighing open with a soft whoosh. The driver, a man with a kind face and tired eyes, gave him a small nod. "Welcome home, son," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. The soldier could only nod in return, his throat suddenly too tight to form words. He shouldered the duffel bag, the strap digging into his shoulder, a familiar grounding weight. He stepped down the stairs and onto the solid pavement. The air hit him then, thick and humid, smelling of freshly cut grass, car exhaust, and something else, something sweet and alive. It was the smell of home. It filled his lungs, and for the first time in a very long time he felt like he could truly breathe. He started walking, his boots scuffing softly against the cracked sidewalk. The 3 blocks to his house had never seemed so long, and yet he didn't want to rush it. He wanted to savor every moment, every sight, every sound. He heard the distant buzz of a lawnmower, the cheerful chirping of sparrows in the trees, the laughter of children playing in a nearby yard. These were the sounds of normalcy, the soundtrack of a life he had almost forgotten. It was a beautiful, simple symphony, and he was its most devoted audience. He passed Mrs. Gable's house, her prize-winning roses blooming in a riot of color against the white picket fence. He saw the Hendersons' golden retriever, Buster, sleeping in a patch of sunlight on their front porch. Every detail was a piece of a puzzle he was slowly putting back together. A picture of the life that had been waiting for him. With each step, his heart beat a little faster, a frantic, hopeful drum against his ribs. He could feel the key in his pocket, a warm, heavy presence. He was already rehearsing the moment in his mind. He would walk up the path, the one with the slight crack running down the middle. He would stand on the small wooden porch maybe for just a second to let it all sink in. Then he would take out the key, slide it into the lock, and turn it. He would listen for that click, the most beautiful sound in the world. He would push the door open and step inside, and he would be home. He would close the door on the noise, on the world, on the last 2 years, and he would finally be able to let go. He could almost feel the cool air of the hallway on his skin, almost see the way the light would hit the old photograph of his parents on the mantelpiece in the living room. He reached the corner of his own street. His pace slowed even more, his feet feeling suddenly heavy. He took a deep breath, the air catching in his chest. This was the final turn, the home stretch. A small, hopeful smile touched his lips as he rounded the corner, his eyes lifting, searching for the small blue house with the white trim at the end of the block. His eyes scanned the street, taking in the familiar houses, the tall oak trees, the neat lawns. They found the yellow house next door, the one with the bright door, exactly where it was supposed to be. But where his house should be, there was only a gap, an empty space that seemed to suck the light and the color out of the world around it. The smile on his lips faltered, then vanished completely, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated confusion. He stopped dead in his tracks, the duffel bag slipping from his shoulder and landing with a soft thud on the sidewalk beside him. He blinked, certain his tired eyes were playing a trick on him. But when he opened them again, the empty space was still there. The duffel bag hit the sidewalk with a soft thud, a sound that seemed to be swallowed by the sudden, roaring silence in his head. He stood frozen, one foot still slightly lifted, a man caught in the middle of a step that no longer had a destination. His eyes, wide and unblinking, refused to accept the message they were sending to his brain. It was like looking at a photograph with a neat, rectangular hole cut out of the middle. The edges of the hole were familiar, the yellow house next door, the old oak tree across the street, the crack in the pavement he'd tripped on 100 times. But the center, the most important part, was just gone. He blinked, hard, a slow, deliberate motion, as if he could reset the picture like a flickering screen. When his eyes opened again, the scene was unchanged. An empty lot. A flat, barren patch of brown dirt surrounded by a brand-new chain-link fence that glinted harshly in the afternoon sun. It wasn't the chaotic mess of a fire or the splintered wreckage of a storm. It was clean. It was sterile. It was an erasure. A strange, high-pitched buzzing started in his ears. He took a slow, stumbling step forward, his boots feeling clumsy and foreign on the ground he knew so well. He looked down the street in the other direction, as if his house might have somehow picked itself up and moved down the block. But there was nothing. Just the same neat houses, the same peaceful street, the same world that was continuing on as if nothing had happened. He turned his gaze back to the empty space, his mind scrambling for an explanation that made any kind of sense. A mistake. It had to be a mistake. He was on the wrong street. He looked at the street sign, a faded green rectangle on the corner. Oakwood Avenue. He was in the right place. His eyes darted to the house next door, the one with the bright yellow door. He remembered the couple who lived there, how they always waved. It was still there, solid and real, its yellow paint a cheerful, mocking beacon next to the void. He began to walk toward the lot, his legs feeling heavy, as if he were wading through water. The closer he got, the more unreal it became. He could see the stark brown rectangle of dirt, scarred by the tracks of heavy machinery. He could see the neat uniform, posts of the chain-link fence topped with little loops of wire that looked almost decorative. In the center of the lot, standing tall and proud like a tombstone in a graveyard, was a large corporate sign. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He didn't want to read it. He wanted to turn around, pick up his bag and get back on the bus to go back to a world where his house was still a memory, a promise. But his feet kept moving, carrying him to the edge of the fence. He wrapped his fingers around the cold metal links, the rough texture digging into his palm. He leaned forward, his breath fogging the air in front of him. The letters on the sign were bold and black, a stark, impersonal font against a white background. He read the words one by one, his mind struggling to string them together into a coherent thought. Future site of the Oakwood Commons luxury apartments. The words were so normal, so mundane, that they felt like a physical blow. Luxury apartments. He read the line below it. By Blackwood Developments. A name. A faceless entity that had reached out and simply erased his life. He let go of the fence and stumbled back a step. The buzzing in his ears grew louder, and the world began to tilt at a strange angle. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the familiar, solid shape of the key. He pulled it out and held it in his palm. It was just a piece of brass tarnished and worn. For 2 years it had been a sacred object, a symbol of everything he was fighting for. It was the key to his sanctuary, his refuge, the only place in the world where he felt truly whole. Now it was a useless piece of metal, a relic from a place that no longer existed. It was a key to nothing. A cruel, pointless joke. He closed his hand around it, the sharp edges digging into his skin, a small sharp pain in the midst of the vast, numb emptiness that was spreading through his chest. He felt a disconnect, as if he were watching this happen to someone else. He saw a man standing on a sidewalk, a man in a worn jacket with a duffel bag at his feet, a man staring at an empty lot where his home used to be. He saw the man's shoulders slump, saw his head bow, saw the way his whole body seemed to shrink in on itself, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he was that man. The anchor he had clung to through the darkest storms had not just pulled loose, it had never been there at all. The rope had been cut long ago and he had just been treading water, deluding himself into thinking he was still tied to the shore. With a shaking hand, he fumbled in his other pocket for his phone. The screen felt slick and cold under his trembling fingers. He had to see. He had to have some kind of proof, some kind of evidence that he wasn't going crazy. He swiped it open, his thumb slipping on the glass several times before he got it right. He opened the map application, the little blue dot pulsing on the screen, a beacon of his location. He watched as the satellite image loaded, a grainy overhead view of the world. He zoomed in, his heart pounding with a desperate, foolish hope. The blue dot representing him was sitting right on top of a small blue-roofed building. The app showed a house, a neat little square with a driveway, a digital ghost, a memory stored in a server somewhere, a lie told by a machine. The technology, the one thing that was supposed to be infallible, was just as wrong as his own memory. He lowered the phone, the glowing screen a pale light against the deepening gloom of his own thoughts. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street. The sounds of the neighborhood started to filter back into his consciousness. The distant bark of a dog, the hum of a refrigerator from a nearby house, the laughter of children being called inside for dinner. These were the sounds of a normal life, a life that was happening all around him, a life that he was no longer a part of. He was a ghost, standing on the edge of a world that had moved on, a spectator to a play he didn't know the lines to. He was a soldier who had returned from a war only to find that his home had been a casualty of a different kind of battle, one he never even knew was being fought. And in the quiet, empty space where his house used to stand, there was only the deafening sound of his own silence. The initial shock was a cold, heavy blanket, smothering everything. It numbed his limbs and muted the world, leaving him standing on the sidewalk like a statue. But the soldier in him, the part that had been trained to act when everything was falling apart, refused to let the blanket settle. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, a new feeling began to push through the numbness. It was a cold, methodical calm, the kind of calm that comes right before you have to clear a building or cross a dangerous open space. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Confusion was an enemy to be defeated. He had to know. He had to understand. His first thought was of his sister. She was the one who had been collecting his mail, sending him updates and care packages that felt like lifelines. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, he picked up his phone from the ground where he had dropped it. The screen was cracked, a new spiderweb of lines spreading across the glass. He found her number in his contacts, his thumb hovering over the call button for a second. He was afraid to hear her voice, afraid of the normalcy it would represent. But he had to know. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright and full of a warmth that felt like it belonged to another universe. "You're home. You're finally home. How was it? Are you okay?" The questions tumbled out one after the other, a barrage of cheerful concern. He couldn't bring himself to answer them. He cut through her excitement, his own voice flat and distant. "The house is gone." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a beat of confused silence. "What do you mean it's gone? Did you go to the wrong street?" "I'm standing right here," he said, his eyes fixed on the empty plot of dirt. "It's just not here. It's a construction site." He could hear her breathing, could picture her frowning on the other end. "That's impossible. I got your mail just last week. The power bill, the water bill. Everything was normal. Did you get anything else? Anything from the city or a lawyer?" He tried to keep the accusation out of his voice, but a little bit of it crept in anyway. There was another longer pause. "Well, now that you mention it," she said, her voice suddenly smaller. "There was this thick envelope a few months back. It looked like one of those official notices. I thought it was junk mail, you know? The kind they send everyone trying to sell you something. I think I might have thrown it out." The words hit him like a physical blow. Junk mail. His entire life, his home, had been reduced to a piece of junk mail that got thrown away. He felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but he pushed it down. It wasn't her fault. She was busy. She had a life. He was the one who had been a world away, a ghost. "It's okay," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Don't worry about it. I'll figure it out." He ended the call before she could say anything else, the sudden silence feeling even louder than her voice had been. The next day, he felt like a man walking through a dream. He borrowed his sister's car and drove to the center of the city, a place he barely recognized anymore. Towering glass buildings had replaced the old brick storefronts he remembered. He found the city planning office in a monolithic concrete structure that smelled of floor wax and stale air. He walked through the sliding glass doors and into a world of humming fluorescent lights and endless gray cubicles. It was a place designed to crush the human spirit, a labyrinth of bureaucracy where hope went to die. He waited for nearly 2 hours on a hard plastic chair, watching a clock on the wall tick away the seconds with excruciating slowness. People came and went, clutching folders and looking stressed. No one made eye contact. Finally, a woman with a tired face and glasses perched on the end of her nose called his name. He followed her back to a small cubicle, where she sat down in front of a humming computer monitor. "How can I help you?" she asked, her voice devoid of any real interest. He explained the situation as simply as he could. "I was deployed. I came home. My house is gone." The woman didn't seem surprised. She just typed a few things into her computer, her fingers clicking on the keyboard. "Name and address," she said, not looking up at him. He told her. She typed some more. Then she nodded slowly. "Ah, yes. The Oakwood Avenue property. It was acquired by Blackwood Developments 6 months ago." She said it so casually as if she were commenting on the weather. "Acquired?" he repeated, the word feeling foreign and wrong in his mouth. "What does that mean?" She sighed, a long, weary sound, and finally looked at him. There was a flicker of sympathy in her eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by the professional mask she wore. "It means the city sold it to them. It was a compulsory purchase order, part of the new urban renewal initiative." She got up and disappeared into a back room, returning a few minutes later with a thick manila folder. She dropped it on the desk in front of him. It landed with a heavy thud. "This is the file," she said. "All the notices, the public hearing records, the final seizure order. It was all done by the book." He stared at the folder, his hands trembling slightly. He reached out and opened it. The first document was a letter, printed on crisp official city letterhead. It was a notice of a public hearing to discuss the proposed sale of his property. The date was from over a year ago. He flipped through the pages, a growing sense of dread building in his stomach. There were surveyor's reports, legal documents, and more notices. All were addressed to his house, the house that no longer existed. They had all been forwarded to his sister's address, lost in a pile of junk mail in everyday life. The final document was a seizure order, signed and stamped, declaring that the property was now the legal possession of Blackwood Developments. "But why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How could they do this?" The woman pointed to a paragraph in one of the reports. According to the City Commission survey, the property was deemed structurally unsound and blighted. It was an eyesore, they said. A detriment to the neighborhood. He read the words, his blood running cold. Structurally unsound. It was a lie. A bald-faced, disgusting lie. He remembered the weekend before he had left, the one he had spent on the roof, hammering down new shingles, making sure everything was perfect for his return. He had taken pride in that house, in keeping it up. They hadn't just taken his home. They had slandered its memory to justify their theft. He closed the folder, the sound of the paper slapping together echoing in the quiet cubicle. He had the what and the how. It was all there in black and white, a neat and tidy paper trail that led to the destruction of his life. But he didn't have the why, not the real why. He looked at the woman, at her tired, resigned face. He knew she was just a cog in a machine, but he hated her in that moment for being a part of it. He stood up, leaving the folder on her desk. "Thank you," he said, the words hollow and empty. He walked out of the cubicle, his back straight, his jaw set. The numbness was gone completely now, replaced by a cold, hard fire. He was no longer a lost ghost wandering the streets. He was a soldier again, and he had just been given a new mission. The folder felt like a lead weight in his hand, a tangible record of a crime committed on paper. He walked out of the city building and into the bright afternoon sun, the sterile, recycled air of the office replaced by the city's exhaust fumes and the smell of street food. The numbness was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fire that had been smoldering in his gut since he first saw the empty lot. He was no longer a victim of circumstance. He was a man with a target. The folder had given him the enemy's name, Blackwood Developments. Now he just needed their address. A quick search on his phone pointed him to the heart of the city's financial district, a place of towering glass and steel monuments to money and power. He drove his sister's car through the canyons of concrete, feeling small and insignificant. The building he was looking for was one of the tallest, a shimmering spire of reflective glass that seemed to scrape the clouds. The name Blackwood Developments was etched in sleek silver letters across the front, a declaration of ownership and power. It wasn't a building, it was a statement. It was the physical embodiment of the force had reached out and casually erased his life from the map. He parked the car on the street and walked toward the entrance, his worn jacket and scuffed boots feeling ridiculously out of place amidst the flurry of suits and briefcases. He pushed through a heavy glass door into a lobby that was more like a cathedral of commerce. The floor was polished marble so perfect he could see his own distorted reflection in it. The air was cool and smelled of expensive perfume and money. In the center of the vast, quiet space, a woman with a perfect smile and a headset sat behind a desk that was more of an altar. She looked up as he approached, her eyes flicking over him with a quick, almost imperceptible judgment. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice as smooth and polished as the marble floor. "I'm here to see someone from Blackwood Developments," he said, his voice sounding rough and loud in the hushed silence. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her smile never wavering. "No." The smile tightened just a fraction. "Perhaps I can schedule something for you." "Who were you hoping to speak with?" "The person responsible for the Oakwood Commons project," he said, his eyes locked on hers. He saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a brief moment of calculation. She knew what he was talking about. "One moment, please," she said, picking up a sleek black phone. She spoke into it in a low voice, too quiet for him to hear. After a moment, she hung up. "Someone will be down to see you shortly. Please have a seat." She gestured to a cluster of black leather chairs that looked as if they had never been sat in. He didn't sit. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city below. He could see the tiny cars and the tiny people, a world that kept moving, oblivious. He waited for 10 minutes, then 15. He knew it was a tactic, a way to make him feel small and unimportant, but it didn't work. The longer he waited, the more the fire in his gut grew. He had spent 2 years waiting in far worse places for far more dangerous things. He could wait. Finally, a man stepped out of an elevator and walked toward him. He was in his late 40s with a tailored suit that probably cost more than the soldier's last truck. His hair was perfectly cut and his smile was a practiced, disarming thing. "I'm the project manager for Oakwood Commons," he said, extending a hand. "I understand you had some questions." The soldier looked at the outstretched hand but didn't take it. The man's smile faltered for a second before he smoothly retracted his hand. "Right this way," he said, turning and leading the soldier toward the elevator. The office was on the 30th floor, with a breathtaking view of the city. It was spacious and minimalist, decorated with modern art that looked expensive and meaningless. The project manager gestured for him to sit in a chair opposite a large mahogany desk. "So," the man began, leaning back in his leather chair and steepling his fingers. "How can I help you?" The soldier didn't waste time with pleasantries. He leaned forward and placed the manila folder on the desk, pushing it across the polished wood. "I'm the owner of the property on Oakwood Avenue, the one you call blighted." He said the word with a quiet, simmering contempt. The project manager didn't even look at the folder. He sighed, a sound of weary patience. "Yes, we were expecting you might be in touch. Look, I want to assure you that we followed every legal protocol to the letter. The city council approved the project unanimously. We held a public hearing. All the proper notices were sent. The notices were sent to an empty lot," the soldier said, his voice low and steady. "The house you tore down was my home. I was serving overseas. I didn't get your notices." The man's expression softened into a mask of practiced sympathy. "Well, that is unfortunate, truly. But from a legal standpoint, our obligation was to the address on file. We fulfilled that obligation." He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper, which he slid across the desk. It was a check. "This is the fair market value for the property, as determined by an independent appraiser. We've even included a 20% displacement stipend as a gesture of goodwill." The soldier looked down at the check. He saw the number printed on it, a long string of digits that was supposed to represent his home. It was a number that was supposed to compensate for the squeak of the third floorboard, for the light hitting his parents' photograph, for the feeling of safety he had clung to for 2 years. It was an insult. It was a slap in the face. He didn't pick up the check. He looked the man in the eye, and for the first time, the project manager's confident smile wavered. He saw something in the soldier's eyes that made him uncomfortable. It wasn't anger or sadness. It was something harder, something colder. It was the look of a man who had seen things that couldn't be unseen. A man who wasn't impressed by a suit or a view or a number on a piece of paper. "You can't buy a man's home," the soldier said, his voice quiet but clear. "You can only buy the dirt it stood on, in a world of glass and steel." He turned and walked toward the door without another word. "Wait," the project manager said, a hint of desperation in his voice. "This is a very generous offer. It's more than you would have gotten on the open market." The soldier paused at the door, his hand on the handle. He didn't turn around. "It's not about the market," he said. Then he opened the door and walked out, leaving the man and his money behind in the sterile office with the beautiful view. The elevator ride down was silent. As the glass doors of the lobby slid open with a soft hiss, he felt a sense of finality, as if a door to a part of his life had just closed forever. He stepped out into the noise and the heat of the city, a man adrift. He had faced the enemy, and he had won a small personal victory by refusing their offer. But he was still homeless. He was still a ghost. He walked until he found a small park, and he sat on a bench watching the world go by. He felt the weight of the last 2 days pressing down on him, and for the first time he felt truly, utterly lost. But then, he reached into his wallet and pulled out a faded photograph of the woman he had loved, standing on the porch of their house, laughing. He remembered her telling him, "A house is just wood and nails. Home is wherever we are. It's the peace we carry inside us." He looked at the photograph and then at the sky, and he felt a shift inside him. They had taken his house, but they hadn't taken his home. He just had to find it again. He stood up from the bench, a new sense of resolve settling in his chest. He didn't know where he would go or what he would do next. But he knew He stood up, pushing the chair back with a soft scrape. He left the check on the desk, a useless piece of paper certainty that settled deep in his bones that he would be okay. He had survived a war. He could survive this. He sat on the park bench as the sun bled out across the horizon, painting the clouds in strokes of orange and purple. The city lights began to blink on one by one, a distant cold constellation. Around him the world was winding down. The laughter of children had been replaced by the distant wail of a siren, the chirping of birds by the hum of traffic. He was an island of stillness in a river of movement, a man with no destination. The confrontation in the glass tower had left him feeling hollowed out, like a tree struck by lightning. He had stood his ground. He had refused their money, but it felt like a small, meaningless victory. They still had the land. They were still going to build their luxury apartments. He was still homeless. He reached into his wallet and pulled out the faded photograph for what felt like the 100th time. The woman in the picture smiled back at him, her head tilted, her eyes full of a light that the world hadn't been able to dim. She was standing on the porch of the house that was now a memory, a wisp of smoke. He remembered the day he took it. The sun had been setting just like it was now, and she had been teasing him about taking too long to fix the squeaky floorboard. "A house is just wood and nails," she had told him later that evening as they sat on that same porch watching the fireflies. "Home is wherever we are. It's the peace we carry inside us." He had nodded, but he hadn't really understood. He had thought the house was the peace. He thought the four walls and the locked door were what kept the demons out. Now, with the walls gone and the door nothing but a pile of splinters, he was finally beginning to grasp her meaning. The peace wasn't in the house. The peace was supposed to be in him, and he had lost it. He sat there until the last sliver of sun disappeared and the park was bathed in the artificial glow of the streetlights. He felt the weight of the duffel bag at his feet, a physical reminder of the life he was supposed to be living. He thought about the key in his pocket, a useless piece of metal that was suddenly too heavy to carry. He couldn't throw it away. It was a part of his story, but he couldn't keep carrying it around like a dead weight. He stood up, a decision forming in his mind. Not a grand plan, but a single, simple next step. He didn't go back to his sister's house. He didn't call anyone. He just started walking. He walked through the sleeping city, his footsteps echoing on the empty pavement. He walked until the tall buildings gave way to smaller houses, until the smell of exhaust was replaced by the scent of damp earth and night-blooming flowers. He walked for hours, letting the rhythm of his own movement quiet the noise in his head. He was heading out, away from the center of the city that had swallowed his home, away from the glass and the steel and the lies. As the first hint of gray light began to soften the eastern sky, he found himself on the edge of a large, wooded park that bordered a long, narrow lake. He followed a path into the trees, the air growing cooler and cleaner. The path led him to a small wooden dock that jutted out into the still, dark water. He walked to the end of the dock and sat down, his legs dangling over the edge. The water was like a sheet of black glass reflecting the pre-dawn sky. It was quiet, so profoundly quiet. It was the kind of quiet he had been dreaming of for 2 years. He sat there until the sun rose, a perfect golden orb climbing over the tree line and setting the water ablaze with light. He watched the birds wake up, listened to the gentle lapping of the water against the pilings. He felt the tension in his shoulders begin to loosen, just a little. He pulled the key from his pocket. He looked at it, turning it over in his fingers. It had once been a symbol of a locked door, a private sanctuary. Now it was a symbol of a lock that no longer existed. He thought about his wife's words again. The peace we carry inside us. He couldn't carry the key anymore, but he could carry the memory. He stood up and with a flick of his wrist he sent the key sailing out into the lake. It made a small, almost silent plop as it hit the water, and then it was gone. He watched the ripples spread out and disappear, and with them a small piece of his anger and his grief. It wasn't a solution, but it was a release. He spent the next few days by the lake. He slept on the ground, wrapped in a blanket from his duffel bag. He ate small cans of food from a convenience store he found a few miles away. He didn't think about the future. He just existed. He watched the water. He watched the sky. He watched the people who came to the park to walk their dogs or fish from the shore. He was an observer, a ghost again. But this time it felt different. It felt peaceful. On the third day, he was walking along a trail deeper in the woods when he came across an old abandoned ranger station. It was a small, simple cabin made of rough-hewn logs with a tin roof that was rusted through in places. The porch had collapsed on one end and one of the windows was boarded up. It was a forgotten place, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. He pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and damp wood and decades of disuse. It was empty, but it was solid. It was a shelter. He stood in the middle of the single room, a shaft of sunlight illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. And he felt something stir inside him. A flicker of purpose. This place was broken and he knew how to fix broken things. He went back to his campsite by the lake and returned with his duffel bag. He didn't have much, but he had a small multi-tool that had been a gift from his unit. It had a pair of pliers, a screwdriver, and a small saw. He started with the porch. He found fallen branches that were strong and straight, and he spent the afternoon carefully measuring and cutting them, lashing them together with wire he found in a rusted-out shed behind the cabin. It was slow, painstaking work. His hands, which had been idle for so long, became covered in splinters and calluses. But as he worked, he felt a change taking place. The rhythmic motion of the saw, the focused effort of fitting the pieces together, the solid thud of the hammer he fashioned from a rock and a piece of wood. It was a language he understood. It was the language of building, not destroying. For the first time in a long time, he was creating something. Days turned into a week, then two. He found an old hardware store in a small town a few miles away, and traded the few dollars he had left for a proper hammer, some nails, and a sheet of plywood to fix the window. He worked from sunup to sundown, lost in the simple, physical labor. He cleared the debris from inside the cabin, swept the floors, and patched the holes in the roof. He wasn't just fixing a building. He was mending himself. Each nail he drove was a small act of defiance against the chaos that had taken his life. Each board he replaced was a step toward a new foundation. One evening, after a long day of work, he sat on the newly repaired porch, watching the sun set over the lake. The cabin was still rough, still unfinished, but it was sturdy. It was sound. He looked at his hands, rough and dirty, and felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't felt in years. He had a splinter in his thumb, and it was the best feeling in the world. It was a real pain, a tangible pain from a real day's work. It was a pain that meant something. He thought about the house in the city, the one with the blue roof and the squeaky floorboard. He could still picture it clearly, but the image no longer brought him a sharp, stabbing pain. It was just a memory now, a soft, faded photograph in his mind. They had taken the house, but they couldn't take the memories, and they couldn't take the peace he was slowly, painstakingly building for himself, one nail at a time. He didn't know what he was going to do tomorrow or next week or next year. He didn't have a 5-year plan. He just had a cabin to finish. He had a roof to patch. He had a life to rebuild. Not on the land they had stolen from him, but on the solid ground of his own 2 feet. And as the stars began to appear in the vast, dark sky, he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he was finally home.